How can I be happy in my life? Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you think about it, being happy every day is probably the hardest thing in the world to achieve. Scientifically speaking, our brains are not designed to be happy. Human instincts are more inclined to focus on problems than to enjoy the moment. It's as if you take a bite of sweet ice cream and the next moment your brain is already saying, "That's a lot of calories. Don't eat too much of that." Psychologists also have a term called happiness adaptation. It means that no matter what happens, human beings will quickly get used to it. You can't be happy for long when you win the lottery, but you start worrying about how to spend it. The joy of a promotion is overshadowed by higher work pressure in less than 2 weeks. That's why even more happy events can't fill up our daily life. Have you ever noticed that daily worries are more common than daily happiness? Let's say that worries are like sand, which can get into your shoes anytime, while happiness is like a rainbow in the sky, which can only show up once in a while when the conditions are right. Let's talk about the American President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's troubles were denser than sand. Born into a very poor family, he grew up in a very difficult life, with little formal education and was completely self-educated. As an adult, his life was not always smooth. He failed in business, and when he was a lawyer, he was ridiculed as a hick because of his lack of social skills. Not to mention the great tragedies in his family, the deaths of his 2 sons, especially his favorite son, Willie, nearly crushed him. It was his inner depression that caused Lincoln the most pain. He often wrote poems or notes to pour out his grief. The biography says that at one point he thought his depression was an innate destiny, and in his own words, "If I live to die, what is the meaning of this living?" Doesn't that sound quite disturbing? However, Abraham Lincoln was not completely immersed in the sand. In fact, his rainbow came from his sense of mission and sense of humor. Yes, you read that correctly. Lincoln was known for his humor, even though he was often plagued by depression. He often diffused tensions in public with a joke. Once, when a political opponent mocked him for being ugly, he calmly responded, "That's the face God gave me, and I'm sorry it made you uncomfortable." More importantly, he led the United States through the darkest days of the Civil War. His Emancipation Proclamation changed the fate of countless people and earned him the respect of future generations. During the toughest of times, Lincoln sustained himself by his beliefs in freedom and equality. These beliefs became the most splendid rainbow in his life. He also once said, "How happy most people are depends on how happy they resolve to be." This statement sounds simple, but for a man who suffered from depression, it was a lifelong lesson for him. He understood that happiness may be fleeting and conditional, but if you can find a little rainbow of light in a pile of sand, it's worth holding on to. Everyone knows that Winston Churchill was one of the most important leaders in British history. His life is a classic example of the intertwining of the sand of trouble and the rainbow of joy. Churchill grew up as a troubled man. His grades were poor, his personality was stubborn, and he was even called the most unpromising student by his teachers. As an adult, he entered politics, and it didn't go well at first. When he was Secretary of State for the Navy, he was directly scolded because of the failure of the Battle of Dardanelles, and finally lost his post. This failure was undoubtedly humiliating for Churchill, and he fell into a state of severe depression for a time. Churchill himself even gave his depression a name, called Black Dog. He described this black dog always hide in his shadow, from time to time jump out to bite him. But such a troubled man also had his rainbow moments. The most famous, of course, was his leadership in World War II. When Britain faced a huge threat from the Nazis, he stood up and gave a series of inspiring speeches, such as the classic, "We will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the streets, we will not surrender." These speeches ignited the hopes of the British and left an indelible rainbow mark on history. Churchill once said, "Success is nothing more than going from one failure to another without losing enthusiasm." He understood that troubles were the norm, like the sand that gets into his shoes every day, but he chose to seize those fleeting moments of joy, such as the sense of accomplishment that comes from overcoming adversity, or the peaceful times when he was painting at home. Yes, Churchill was actually a pretty good painter. He said that when he was painting, he felt he could forget about the black dog for a while. Now let's talk about why happiness is always fragmented. Let's tell the story of Van Gogh, the artist known as the father of post-impressionism, who is synonymous with fragmented happiness. Van Gogh's life can be summarized in one word: chaos. Poverty, loneliness, and mental illness characterized almost all of his days. When he was alive, his works were virtually unknown, and he sold only one painting. Most of the time, he lived in a modest house, relying on the financial support of his brother, Theo, to get by. Even in a psychiatric hospital, he had to fight his inner demons. Yet, this is the man who created such heirloom classics as Starry Night, Sunflower, and Café Nocturne. When did his joy come? In those passionate, creative moments. Van Gogh wrote to his brother, "When I paint, I can feel a brief moment of peace and fulfillment, as if the weight of life had been temporarily lifted." These moments were not long, but they were real. His Starry Night is a representative example. You might not imagine that this colorful, hopeful work was done by the window of a mental hospital. He despaired of his struggling life, but found a moment of peace when he looked up at the night sky. These fleeting fragments of joy became his harbor to escape from pain. However, these fragments of happiness could not really change his life. He was still consumed by deep loneliness and despair, and even chose to end his life. His story makes us realize that happiness is really like stars, always dotted in the dark night sky, rather than an eternal existence. Scientists have studied this and say it's because our brain circuits are more sensitive to threats and problems than to happiness. Think of it this way: in ancient times we were hunters, and if all we could do was stare at, "Wow, what a beautiful sunset," we would have been taken by a tiger long ago. So that ability to dwell on pleasure for long periods of time is probably not something we were born with. On the other hand, worries always seem to last. Have you ever had that feeling? Lying in bed at night, even if one or two nice things happen today, what ends up occupying your mind is still the same bad stuff. Like the scene last week when you were disliked at work, that unpleasant argument, or the trouble you might get into tomorrow. It's not your fault, it's a human design flaw. Psychologists have mentioned the theory of negative bias, which says that humans tend to remember negative events more fondly, and that it can even affect your mood like a chronic poison. However, it's not that happiness is completely out of the question. In fact, although our happiness is not as pervasive as worry, it also has its own rhythm. 2 days ago, I read an article which mentioned a couple's daily life. They have a particularly interesting habit. Every night will be the day's happy moments recorded in a small notebook. For example, the wife wrote, "The first rose bloomed in the garden today. It smells so good." Husband wrote, "In the morning, my little daughter drew me a crooked picture and said, 'Daddy is a big hero.'" These things may seem particularly insignificant, but they say that when they look through these records, they realize that there are still a lot of little happinesses hidden in their daily lives. So yeah, happiness isn't something that hangs out in front of our eyes every day like worries, but it's not something that's out of reach either. The key lies in your willingness to catch it. Those happy moments may be in the moment you casually look down, look up, such as the first bite of breakfast freshly baked buns, the roadside accidentally saw the dog wagging its tail at you, or a friend sent you an emoticon that made you laugh out loud. All these little moments add up to make us feel like today is actually not so bad. Have you ever felt that happiness always comes and goes quickly, but instead, it's worry, anxiety, and that inexplicable uneasiness that sticks to you like a psoriasis and won't come off? In fact, this really cannot be entirely to blame us. Blame the brain design is too anti-human. Let's start with animals. Have you ever seen a fox chasing a rabbit and stopping to think, "Wow, the sky is so blue, and the wind is blowing so comfortably"? No, right? Once a fox starts thinking like that, it starves to death. And that rabbit, if it's halfway through the run and suddenly thinks, this grass is pretty, let's eat some grass, it probably wouldn't be able to run for more than a few days before becoming the fox's dinner. This is the logic of biological survival. In nature, happiness is actually a luxury. Animals' emotions mostly revolve around vigilance, anger, and fear, which help them perceive danger, escape threats, and compete for resources. What about humans? Let's not forget that we were once part of the animal species. Although we now have cell phones, coffee shops, and Netflix, our genes are still stuck in the primitive tribal hunting days. Back then, if you were constantly in a happy mood, you could be eaten by a tiger in the next minute. Speaking of brain design, you may be thinking, isn't this thing supposed to help us live better? Yes, it does want to help, but it does so in a way that is a bit, how can I put it, overly protective. There's a Harvard University psychology study that might make you laugh and cry about your life. The study found that humans spend 47% of their waking hours lost in thought. And people who are distracted tend to be unhappy. Why? When we're distracted, our brain automatically goes into a threat anticipation mode. That means it's constantly scanning its surroundings, looking for things that could go wrong. For example, if you're sitting on the couch and you're lost in thought, the question may pop into your head, will my job go wrong tomorrow? Or, is my friend slow to reply to my messages today? Is she having a problem with me? And so on. In fact, most of these questions don't actually happen, but your brain just likes to plan ahead. Biologically, this makes sense. If it didn't, our ancestors would have been wiped out by predators. But in modern life, this self-imposed pessimism filter is particularly tiring. Imagine you are in an ancient forest. There is a beautiful lake in the distance, and you think, wow, it's so beautiful. I really want to go there and take a look. But then your brain immediately jumps in and says, no, there might be crocodiles at that lake. Better not go. You see, the unhappy mechanism is at work again. Why does the brain do this? Simply, negative emotions are more likely to help us survive. If you always see possible dangers and stay alert to them, you are better able to avoid them. Conversely, if you're always immersed in good things, it's easy to ignore threats and even pay with your life. And what about pleasure? It's more of a reward mechanism that motivates us to do things that help us survive, such as eating, finding a partner, or accomplishing a task. But this reward is often short-lived because the brain is afraid that you will get caught up in it and lose track of what's going on. From a neuroscience perspective, there are actually two main parts of our brain that manage emotions. 1. The amygdala, responsible for perceiving threats and initiating the fight or flight response. It is particularly sensitive and always prioritizes negative information. 2. Prefrontal cortex, responsible for analyzing and controlling emotions. It balances the responses of the amygdala so that we are not completely dominated by negative emotions. The problem is that the amygdala reacts much faster than the prefrontal cortex. When you're upset about something, the amygdala jumps in first and gives you a bad feeling, while the prefrontal cortex takes time to analyze, is it really that bad? This time lag is why we always feel strong negative emotions and find it hard to get rid of them. While swiping through social media recently, I came across a solid paragraph. When I work, I want to rest, and when I rest, I want to work, and as a result, there's not a moment of happiness. Did it seem apt? In fact, there is a very counterintuitive truth behind this quote. Being busy has the potential to make people happier. When it comes to workaholics, many people's minds may conjure up an image of a man in a suit, not smiling, working late into the night every day. How can such a person be happy when he or she is supposed to be under a lot of stress? But psychological studies have shown that workaholics tend to be happier than those who have nothing better to do. Why? There's a very classic study done by University of Chicago psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He came up with the concept of flow. Simply put, flow is the idea that when you are fully focused on something, time seems to stop and the only thing left in the world is you and the task at hand. When a person enters a state of mindful flow, the brain releases dopamine, a chemical associated with happiness. So those who are busy, especially those who are immersed in their work, are instead more likely to enter a state of mindful flow. And when you're idle, the brain begins to run amok. Thoughts fly to those unfinished tasks, past regrets, and even worry about the future. This state is called by psychologists distraction, and distraction is usually linked to unhappiness. Do you remember Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple? He was recognized as a workaholic. His schedule was always full, so busy that he even had to rely on his assistant to remind him to eat 3 meals a day on time. However, Steve Jobs once said publicly that he found his life very meaningful and lived every day to the fullest. His secret? Apart from his passion for innovation, he had little time to think about boring things. Why does leisure time instead make people more unhappy? Does this conclusion surprise you? After all, most people associate happiness with leisure. However, the truth is that leisure is not the same as happiness. Our brains are born with an early warning mechanism that unconsciously anticipates possible dangers. This mechanism was very important to our ancestors in ancient times. For example, when they heard a noise in the grass, their brain would immediately predict, could it be a tiger? Nowadays, we don't have to deal with tigers on a daily basis, but our brains are still active to detect possible threats. As a result, in our free time, we are more likely to think of work stress, relationship conflicts, and even some inexplicable anxiety. That's why many people feel more irritable when they are idle. The beauty of being busy is that it allows you to focus your attention on what's right in front of you. For example, when you're solving a complex work problem, almost all of your brain's energy is spent processing the current information, leaving no time to anticipate the uncertain threats. In the long run, busy people are actually better able to circumvent meaningless anxiety. Take another interesting example. Former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt was historically known as a multitasker. He almost never stopped from morning to night. In addition to dealing with political affairs, he would also find time to read, write, hunting, and even personally train his own pets. Someone asked him, "Aren't you tired of being so busy?" He replied, "Being busy makes me feel alive." Roosevelt was indeed an example of a man who passed away with a smile on his face, and it is said that his last days were still filled with plans. Of course, this is not to say that we should become outright workaholics. Busyness can be pleasurable, but if one is overly busy and lacks rest, the pleasure is counterproductive. The key is to make your leisure time full. For example, you can try to engage in activities that really interest you during your breaks, rather than just lazing around or swiping your cell phone. Psychologists suggest that creative activities such as reading, painting, or even cooking can help people enter a state of mindfulness and feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Remember the English novelist Jane Austen? She was often so busy writing that she lost track of time, but she wrote in her diary, "Writing is my leisure and my joy." This statement sounds paradoxical, but it points to a key. A happy break is not idleness, but finding an activity that engages you. On the contrary, if you just aimlessly brush up on your drama or play on your cell phone during your leisure time, it may not only fail to bring true happiness, but also lead to a sense of emptiness. This is because this pastime lacks depth and won't give you a sense of engagement or fulfillment. Psychologist Dan Gilbert once said, "The brain's greatest fear is a meaningless void." So instead of letting your brain sit idle and be unhappy, actively choose something meaningful to do. Have you ever noticed that our brains love to stare at the bad? Imagine if 99 good things happen to you in a day, such as your morning coffee is brewed just right, your work is done on time, and your coworkers compliment you on your tasteful dress. As a result, a stranger cuts in line and argues with you. What do you think about when you go to bed at night? That argument may be replayed over and over again in your mind, completely overshadowing the little moments that made you happy. This phenomenon is not your pretentious, but our brain's pot. Scientists have long discovered that human beings react much more strongly to negative information than positive information, a phenomenon called negative bias. Why is bad news heavier than good news? Let's talk about a true story. You know Warren Buffett, the billionaire known for his investment genius? It is said that one time, his investment manager did a month of research and finally decided to invest in a company that seemed to have a lot of potential. As a result, the company went bankrupt a few weeks later. Warren Buffett didn't get mad. He just said lightly, "It's okay, pay attention next time." But the manager blamed himself for months, always feeling that he had failed miserably, and even a few of his other successful investments were selectively ignored by himself. This is a classic case of negative magnification. Our brains automatically highlight failures in red and bold, while successes are downplayed in the background. Why do bad things always attract more attention? For example, don't you always find more bad news in news reports? Not really. Studies show that in real life, good news is about 80% of the news, while bad news is only 20%. But why do we feel that's not the case at all? Because the media knows that your attention is firmly grabbed by bad news. Earthquake somewhere, celebrity divorce so-and-so, economic crisis. Aren't these headlines more common than "it's another sunny day"? This is one of the reasons why we always feel that the world is getting worse and worse. Going back to your daily life, you probably often get hung up on little slip-ups. For example, if you accidentally misstate a statistic in a meeting today, your coworkers may not even notice it, but you feel like the whole world is staring at you, and you've come up with countless negative comments. In fact, this is part of the human, results-oriented psychology. One psychological experiment is particularly classic. Scientists asked participants to look for smiley icons on a screen. There were dozens of sad expressions on the screen, but only one smiley face. It turned out that most people could find the smiley face quickly, but their attention was more easily drawn to the sad faces around them, and they even felt uneasy because of the number of sad faces. Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and stared at yourself? Maybe you can't help but criticize, "Is my nose too collapsed? My skin doesn't seem smooth enough?" Or maybe you've been complimented on how great you are, but all you can say is, "No, I'm just lucky." We always magnify our shortcomings easily, but we are too stingy to recognize our strengths. Behind this is a lack of something called self-affirmation, which is one of the core elements of our happiness. Let's start with a heartbreaking story. This is a true story from Japan. There was once a high school girl who gradually became silent because of the pressure of study and the indifference of her classmates. In an essay contest, she boldly wrote down what she really thought. She felt like an extra person, and that she would only cause trouble for others. Although her essay won a prize, no one really cared about her feelings. Eventually, the girl chose to commit suicide. In her suicide note, she wrote, "I wish I could like myself, but I really can't." There are many similar tragedies in Japan, which have led psychologists to focus on the impact of self-affirmation on young people's mental health. One study found that a lack of self-affirmation is a major factor in teenage suicide. Think about it. If we always feel that we are not good enough, not worthy of being loved, not worthy of success, where can happiness come from? What is self-affirmation? Simply put, self-affirmation is your recognition and appreciation of yourself. Not just your appearance, but also your spirit, personality, and behavior. It is not the same as narcissism, but rather a heartfelt acceptance of yourself, whether perfect or not. For example, there's a friend, Julie, who every time she receives a compliment says, "No, that's all the help I get." She always felt like she wasn't doing enough and always felt like others were better than her. Even when she received promotions and rewards, the thought, "I'm not worthy," would still pop into her head. This lack of self-assurance not only makes it difficult for her to enjoy success, it also keeps her in a state of constant stress. You may have moments like this too. For example, when you make a small mistake, can't you help but beat yourself up? "How could I have been so stupid?" When you take a break, do you feel guilty? "Shouldn't I have tried harder?" This kind of strict demand on ourselves is actually because we don't appreciate and accept ourselves enough, and we always think, "I'm not good enough." Why is it so hard for us to recognize ourselves? There are both social and psychological factors behind this. We live in an era of like culture. When you open social media, all you see are other people's perfect vacations, beautiful selfies, and successful careers. We can't help but compare ourselves, thinking we're never good enough. And in reality, behind those photos may be the carefully selected and retouched moments of others, rather than the real state of life. Remember Oscar-winning actress Emma Stone? She has spoken openly about her anxiety symptoms. She said, "Behind my smile on the red carpet could be the worry that kept me up all night the night before." She's good-looking and has a successful career, but still gets anxious about her performance because society is always telling us, you could be better. When we lack self-assurance, we can get caught in a cycle called the inferiority complex. For example, if you think you're not good enough, you don't dare to strive for opportunities, and as a result, you miss out on the possibility of improving yourself, and then you feel even more bad about yourself. In the long run, we may lose the power of action and even feel that life is meaningless. Let's take an example of a famous person. The writer Haruki Murakami had a very low self-esteem when he was young. He felt that he was so ordinary that he did not even dare to use his real name when he published his first novel. He said, "I always felt that I didn't belong to the literary circle and that no one would want to read my works." But he eventually persevered with an almost stubborn effort to become the success he is today. If he had been kidnapped by feelings of inferiority, there might not have been the Norwegian wood that we are familiar with. So how do you boost your sense of self-affirmation? 1. Accept imperfection. Accepting yourself doesn't mean you have to be perfect. Everyone has flaws and shortcomings, but that doesn't make you any less deserving of love as a unique individual. Try smiling at yourself in the mirror every day and saying, "I'm pretty good." It may feel awkward at first, but it will work over time. 2. Record positive feedback. Write down compliments or things you feel you've done well. Whether it's a task you accomplished or a good dinner you cooked, it can be your confidence list. When you doubt yourself, look at these notes, and they will remind you that you are better than you think you are. 3. Find something you love. Engage in your favorite activities such as painting, singing, writing, or exercising. These things that make you feel fulfilled will help you build a more positive connection with yourself. As Haruki Murakami says, by finding your own rhythm, you can reconcile yourself to the noise of the world. 4. Avoid comparison. Comparison is the #1 killer of self-affirmation. Everyone has their own rhythm and journey, and what you see in someone else's highlights doesn't represent their entire life. Try focusing on your own growth instead of someone else's accomplishments. Since our brains are inherently biased towards negativity, does that mean we're doomed to be stuck with this design flaw? Not exactly. Some research suggests that we can adjust our emotional responses through deliberate practice. For example, meditation. Spending 10 minutes a day focusing on your breathing can bring the prefrontal cortex online faster and help you regulate negative emotions. Keep a gratitude journal. Writing down 3 things you're grateful for every day can rewrite your brain's sensitivity to positive messages. Exercise. Regular exercise reduces amygdala overactivity, making it easier for you to feel happy. Reshape your thinking. When you feel stuck in a negative emotion, try asking yourself, will this matter still be important a week from now, a year from now? Many times, the answer is no. Focus on the process, not the outcome. The power of negative bias is greatly diminished if you care about the effort and growth of the whole process, not the last little flaw. We may never get rid of our brain's negative design, but that doesn't mean we can't find our own pieces of happiness. Instead of trying to eliminate those negative emotions, we should try to accept their existence and try to find those occasional moments of beauty. It's like what Van Gogh conveyed in his Starry Night. Even when darkness takes over most of the sky, there are always stars twinkling to remind us that the presence of joy, even if fleeting, is worth pursuing. Well, that's it for this installment. Likes and comments are welcome. Thanks for watching.